On April 11, 1951, at 1:00 a.m., General Douglas MacArthur sat in his residence at the American Embassy in Tokyo, reading a message that had just been hand-delivered by an aide. The message was 3 paragraphs long. It had been transmitted from Washington through multiple classified channels to ensure MacArthur received it before the press did. The message informed MacArthur that he had been relieved of all his commands effective immediately. 5-star General, Supreme Commander of Allied Powers in Japan, Commander of United Nations forces in Korea, the man who had accepted Japan's surrender in 1945, the general who had rebuilt an entire nation from ashes, was being fired. Not retired with honors. Not reassigned to a prestigious position in Washington. Fired. The message was signed by President Harry S. Truman. MacArthur's wife, Jean, found him sitting in his study an hour later, still holding the paper. She asked what was wrong. MacArthur looked at her and said 5 words that would become part of American military legend. "Jeannie, we're going home." He did not rage. He did not throw the message across the room. He simply folded the paper, placed it in his desk drawer, and began making arrangements to leave Japan. MacArthur had been in the Far East for 14 years. He had commanded American forces in the Pacific during World War II. He had overseen the occupation and reconstruction of Japan. He had been treated like royalty by the Japanese people, who saw him as the man who had saved their nation from starvation and chaos. Now, he was being ordered home in disgrace, and the American public had no idea why. The official story was simple. President Truman fired MacArthur because the general had publicly disagreed with administration policy on how to fight the Korean War. MacArthur wanted to expand the war into China. Truman wanted to keep it limited to Korea. MacArthur had made statements to the press criticizing Truman's strategy. Truman had warned him to stop. MacArthur ignored the warnings. So Truman fired him for insubordination. That was the story the newspapers printed in April of 1951. That was the story taught in history classes for decades. But that story left out the most important part. The part that actually terrified Truman. The part that made firing MacArthur not just necessary, but urgent. The part that involved a secret plan MacArthur had been developing for months. A plan so dangerous that when Truman's military advisors briefed him on it, the president reportedly went pale and said, "My God, he's actually serious about this." If you want to know what that secret plan was, and why it scared Truman so badly that he had no choice but to fire the most famous general in America, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten Cold War stories with more people. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we're digging into declassified documents every single day to find the stories that textbooks skip. Back to MacArthur and the plan that ended his career. To understand why MacArthur's plan terrified Truman, you need to understand what was happening in Korea in early 1951. The Korean War had started on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The invasion caught American forces completely off guard. Within weeks, North Korean troops had pushed South Korean and American forces all the way down to the Pusan perimeter, a small defensive zone in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula. The situation looked hopeless. Then, MacArthur executed one of the most brilliant military operations in American history. On September 15, 1950, he launched an amphibious invasion at Inchon, a port city on the west coast of Korea, 150 miles behind North Korean lines. The Inchon landing was a massive gamble. The tides at Inchon were some of the most extreme in the world. The landing had to happen at exactly the right time, or the invasion force would be stranded. Military analysts gave the operation a 5,000 to 1 chance of success. MacArthur pulled it off perfectly. The Inchon landing cut North Korean supply lines and forced them to retreat. Within 2 weeks, American and South Korean forces had recaptured Seoul. By early October, they had pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. MacArthur had turned a disaster into a victory. But then he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of stopping at the 38th parallel and declaring victory, MacArthur convinced Truman to let him continue north. The goal was to reunify Korea under a democratic government and eliminate the North Korean military threat permanently. Truman approved the plan with one critical condition. MacArthur was not to provoke China. Chinese leaders had made it clear that they would not tolerate American forces approaching their border. Truman told MacArthur to use only South Korean troops near the Chinese border and to avoid any actions that might bring China into the war. MacArthur ignored those instructions. He pushed American forces all the way to the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. He believed the Chinese were bluffing. He believed they would not dare to confront American military power. On October 15, 1950, MacArthur met with Truman at Wake Island in the Pacific. Truman asked MacArthur directly about the chances of Chinese intervention. MacArthur told the president there was very little chance. He said that if the Chinese tried to intervene, they would face the greatest slaughter in military history. Truman accepted MacArthur's assessment and authorized the continued advance toward the Yalu River. MacArthur was wrong. On October 25, 1950, Chinese forces attacked, not in small numbers, not with limited objectives. The Chinese sent 300,000 troops across the Yalu River in what they called a volunteer army. The attack caught American forces completely unprepared. Chinese troops struck at night, using infiltration tactics and overwhelming numbers. They surrounded American positions, cut off supply lines, and pushed the Eighth Army into a chaotic retreat. The Chinese offensive turned MacArthur's victory into a disaster. By December, American forces had been pushed back below the 38th parallel. The war MacArthur said was almost over had become a desperate fight for survival. Thousands of American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the retreat. The Marines at the Chosin Reservoir fought a brutal 17-day battle just to escape encirclement. MacArthur's prediction of easy victory had been completely wrong. But MacArthur did not accept responsibility for the disaster. Instead, he blamed Washington. He blamed Truman for not letting him bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria. He blamed the Joint Chiefs of Staff for not sending him enough reinforcements. He blamed politicians for fighting a limited war when total war was required. And he began developing a plan to win the war his way, regardless of what Truman wanted. MacArthur's plan had 4 parts. First, he wanted to blockade the Chinese coast to cut off their supplies. Second, he wanted to bomb Chinese cities and industrial centers in Manchuria. Third, he wanted to use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to open a second front against mainland China. Fourth, and this was the part that terrified Truman, MacArthur wanted authorization to use atomic bombs against Chinese military concentrations and supply lines. Not 1 bomb. Not 2 bombs. MacArthur had requested between 30 and 50 atomic bombs to be dropped across a zone stretching from the Yalu River deep into Chinese territory. The bombs would be used to destroy Chinese armies, obliterate their supply routes, and create a radioactive barrier that would prevent Chinese reinforcements from entering Korea. MacArthur believed this strategy would end the war in weeks and secure total victory. MacArthur had begun developing this plan as early as December 1950, right after the Chinese offensive started. He submitted initial proposals to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, requesting permission to expand the war into China. The Joint Chiefs rejected the proposals. Truman rejected them. The United Nations rejected them. But MacArthur did not stop. He continued refining the plan, continued pushing for authorization, and continued making public statements suggesting that limited war was a betrayal of American soldiers fighting in Korea. In late December 1950, MacArthur sent a message to the Joint Chiefs, stating that restrictions on bombing Chinese territory and using nationalist Chinese forces were leading to unnecessary American casualties. He argued that if the administration was not willing to fight the war properly, they should withdraw from Korea entirely. The message was essentially an ultimatum: either let me fight this war my way, or admit defeat. Truman was furious. The President had been dealing with MacArthur's insubordination for months, but this was different. MacArthur was not just criticizing policy. He was actively trying to force Truman's hand by threatening to turn the Korean conflict into World War III. Truman's advisers were deeply worried. Secretary of State Dean Acheson warned that MacArthur's plan would bring the Soviet Union into the war. The Soviets had a mutual defense treaty with China. If American forces bombed Chinese cities and used atomic weapons on Chinese territory, the Soviets would be obligated to respond. That response could mean Soviet forces entering Korea, Soviet attacks on American bases in Japan, or worse, Soviet nuclear attacks on American cities. The United States had a significant advantage in nuclear weapons in 1951, but the Soviets had enough bombs to devastate multiple American cities if a nuclear war started. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told Truman that MacArthur's plan would be the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Bradley believed that if the United States committed its military resources to a total war with China, it would leave Europe vulnerable to Soviet aggression. The real threat was the Soviet Union, not China. Fighting a massive land war in Asia while the Soviets had the capability to invade Western Europe was strategic insanity. But MacArthur did not care about Europe. He cared about Asia. He believed the future of the world would be decided in the Pacific, not the Atlantic. He believed that failing to confront China now would embolden communist expansion across Asia. And he believed that politicians in Washington, who had never commanded troops in combat, had no right to tell him how to fight a war. In January 1951, Truman sent a message to MacArthur ordering him to clear all public statements about policy with Washington before making them. MacArthur acknowledged the order, but continued to make statements to reporters and politicians that contradicted administration policy. On March 7, 1951, MacArthur sent a letter to Congressman Joseph Martin, a Republican who opposed Truman's limited war strategy. In the letter, MacArthur wrote that there was no substitute for victory, and that Asia, not Europe, should be the focus of American military efforts. Martin read the letter on the floor of the House of Representatives on April 5th, making MacArthur's defiance public and humiliating Truman in front of the entire nation. That same week, intelligence reports confirmed something that made Truman's blood run cold. MacArthur had been conducting unauthorized communications with nationalist Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek about using Taiwanese troops in Korea and potentially opening a second front against mainland China. MacArthur had not received authorization from Washington for these discussions. He was conducting his own foreign policy, independent of the President. But the final straw came when Truman's intelligence chief showed him a classified assessment of MacArthur's atomic bomb plan. The assessment had been prepared by a team of military analysts who had reviewed MacArthur's requests for nuclear weapons. The analysts concluded that MacArthur's plan was not just militarily dangerous, it was potentially catastrophic. Dropping 30 to 50 atomic bombs on Chinese territory would kill millions of civilians. It would destroy cities that had no military value. It would contaminate water supplies and agricultural land across northern China and potentially Korea and Japan. The radioactive fallout would spread across the region, affecting American troops and Allied populations. The plan assumed that the Soviet Union would not respond to an American nuclear attack on their ally, which analysts considered an absurd assumption. And most importantly, the plan assumed that using atomic weapons in Asia would not lead to their use in Europe, which was equally absurd. Truman realized that MacArthur was not just proposing a strategy, he was proposing a path to World War III. And based on MacArthur's public statements, his unauthorized communications with Taiwan, and his repeated defiance of presidential orders, Truman had reason to believe MacArthur might try to implement parts of his plan even without authorization. MacArthur had enormous prestige. He was worshipped by many Republican politicians who hated Truman. He had the loyalty of his troops and the respect of the American public. If MacArthur decided to defy a direct presidential order and launch attacks on China, what would happen? Would his commanders follow his orders or the president's? Would the public support Truman or MacArthur? Would Congress impeach Truman for firing the general or support the president's decision? Truman could not take that risk. On April 9, 1951, Truman held a meeting with his closest advisers, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and General Omar Bradley. Truman told them he had made his decision. MacArthur had to be fired immediately. Not in a week, not after a diplomatic transition. Immediately. Marshall, who had served as Army Chief of Staff during World War II and was one of the most respected military leaders in America, supported Truman's decision. Marshall said that MacArthur's actions constituted insubordination and posed a direct threat to civilian control of the military. Bradley agreed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had lost confidence in MacArthur's judgment. Acheson warned that firing MacArthur would create a political firestorm. Republicans would accuse Truman of undermining the war effort. MacArthur would return to the United States as a hero, and Truman would be vilified. But Acheson also agreed that MacArthur had to go. The alternative was too dangerous. Truman signed the order relieving MacArthur of command on April 10th. The plan was to have Secretary of the Army Frank Pace deliver the message to MacArthur in person in Tokyo, allowing the general to receive the news privately before it became public. But a reporter got wind of the story before Pace could reach Tokyo. Truman's press secretary called the president and told him they had maybe an hour before the news broke. Truman made the decision to transmit the order immediately through military channels, rather than risk MacArthur hearing about his firing from the press. That is why MacArthur received the message at 1:00 a.m. in Tokyo. Truman wanted him to know before the rest of the world did. The news hit American newspapers on the morning of April 11, 1951. The reaction was explosive. Republicans accused Truman of betraying American troops and appeasing communism. Senator Joseph McCarthy said Truman's decision was made while drunk on bourbon and Benedictine. Senator Robert Taft said the firing was a disaster for American foreign policy. Millions of Americans agreed. Truman received death threats. Protesters gathered outside the White House. Newspapers called for Truman's impeachment. MacArthur returned to the United States on April 17, 1951. He had not set foot in the country for 14 years. He landed in San Francisco to a crowd of over 500,000 people cheering his name. The city held a parade in his honor. From San Francisco, MacArthur flew to Washington, D.C., where he was invited to address a joint session of Congress. On April 19th, MacArthur walked into the House chamber to a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. He delivered a 34-minute speech defending his conduct and criticizing Truman's limited war strategy. He argued that there was no substitute for victory and that America's enemies in Asia must be defeated completely, not contained. He closed the speech with a line from an old military ballad: "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." The speech was broadcast on national radio and television. 30 million Americans watched or listened. It was the most watched event in television history up to that point. MacArthur's approval rating soared to over 60%. Truman's approval rating dropped to 24%, the lowest of his presidency. But then something unexpected happened. The Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held joint hearings to investigate MacArthur's firing. The hearings lasted 7 weeks. Senators questioned MacArthur, Truman's advisers, and military leaders about the decision to relieve MacArthur of command. During the hearings, details of MacArthur's secret plan began to emerge. senators learned about the atomic bomb requests. They learned about MacArthur's unauthorized communications with Taiwan. They learned about his refusal to follow presidential directives. They learned that every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had supported Truman's decision to fire MacArthur. General Bradley testified that MacArthur's plan to expand the war into China would be strategically disastrous. General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff, testified that MacArthur had repeatedly ignored instructions from Washington. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff, testified that the Air Force did not have enough resources to fight a total war with China while maintaining defenses in Europe. Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, testified that a naval blockade of China would require resources the United States did not have. As the hearings continued, public opinion began to shift. Americans started to understand that MacArthur had not been fired for winning too much or being too aggressive. He had been fired for insubordination and for pushing a plan that could have started World War III. Newspapers that had initially supported MacArthur began publishing editorials questioning his judgment. Polls showed that more Americans were starting to support Truman's decision. By the end of the hearings in June 1951, MacArthur's hero status had faded. The general who had returned to America expecting to be drafted as the Republican presidential candidate found that political support was evaporating. Republican leaders quietly distanced themselves from MacArthur. The public moved on to other issues. MacArthur faded from the spotlight, just as he had predicted in his speech to Congress. But the question remained: what if Truman had not fired MacArthur? What if MacArthur had been allowed to implement his plan? Historians have spent decades analyzing that question, and the consensus is chilling. If MacArthur had been authorized to use atomic bombs against China, the most likely outcome would have been Soviet intervention. The Soviets had a mutual defense treaty with China and had been supplying Chinese forces with weapons and advisors throughout the Korean War. A massive American nuclear attack on Chinese territory would have forced the Soviets to respond, either by entering the war directly or by using their own nuclear weapons. If Soviet forces had entered Korea, American troops would have faced a two-front war against both Chinese and Soviet armies. If the Soviets had used nuclear weapons, the United States would have been forced to respond with its own nuclear strikes, potentially against Soviet territory. That escalation could have led to a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Even if the Soviets had not used nuclear weapons immediately, MacArthur's plan would have required the United States to commit the majority of its military resources to Asia. That would have left Europe vulnerable. The Soviets had over 175 divisions stationed in Eastern Europe in 1951, facing fewer than 15 American and NATO divisions in Western Europe. If the United States had been bogged down in a total war with China, the Soviets could have invaded Western Europe with overwhelming force. American nuclear weapons might have deterred that invasion, but they also might not have. The Soviets had their own nuclear arsenal, and might have calculated that the United States would not risk nuclear war over Europe if it was already fighting a nuclear war in Asia. The result could have been a Soviet conquest of Western Europe and a nuclear exchange that killed tens of millions of people in Asia, Europe, and potentially North America. MacArthur did not believe any of that would happen. He believed the Soviets were too weak to fight the United States. He believed China could be defeated quickly with overwhelming force. He believed that showing strength, not restraint, was the way to prevent World War III. MacArthur had lived through World War I and World War II. He had seen what happened when democracies failed to confront aggressors early. He believed that appeasing communist expansion in Korea would lead to more aggression later, just as appeasing Hitler in the 1930s had led to World War II. From MacArthur's perspective, Truman was repeating the mistakes of Chamberlain, sacrificing long-term security for short-term peace. But Truman saw it differently. Truman had also lived through 2 world wars. He had been an artillery officer in World War I. He had made the decision to use atomic bombs on Japan in 1945. He understood the horror of total war better than most people, and he understood that the world had changed. In 1945, the United States was the only nation with atomic bombs. In 1951, the Soviet Union had them too. Total war was no longer an option. Total war now meant nuclear annihilation. Truman believed that limited war, frustrating as it was the only rational strategy in the nuclear age. The goal in Korea was not to destroy China or defeat communism everywhere. The goal was to prevent North Korea from conquering South Korea, to demonstrate that aggression would be resisted, and to avoid escalation into a global conflict. That strategy required restraint, patience, and the willingness to accept a stalemate rather than demand total victory. MacArthur could not accept that strategy. He had spent his entire career winning wars, not managing them. The idea of fighting a limited war, of accepting a draw, was incomprehensible to him. So he defied Truman, pushed for total war, and ultimately forced Truman to fire him. The Korean War continued for 2 more years after MacArthur's firing. It ended in July 1953 with an armistice that established a demilitarized zone near the 38th parallel, almost exactly where the war had started. North Korea remained communist. South Korea remained democratic. Over 36,000 Americans died in the war, along with hundreds of thousands of Korean and Chinese soldiers and millions of Korean civilians. The war accomplished Truman's limited objective of preventing a communist conquest of South Korea, but it did not achieve MacArthur's goal of total victory. To many Americans, especially those who lost family members in Korea, the war felt like a betrayal. They had been told their sons were fighting for victory, but the war ended in a draw. MacArthur's argument that politicians had prevented the military from winning resonated with those families. The idea that America could have won if only Truman had let MacArthur fight the war properly became a persistent myth. But declassified documents from the 1950s tell a different story. Those documents show that MacArthur's plan was never realistic. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had calculated that blockading China's coast would require a naval force larger than the one the United States had available. Bombing Chinese cities would require air resources that were needed in Europe. Using nationalist Chinese troops would have been militarily ineffective because those troops had been defeated by the Communists in the Chinese Civil War just 2 years earlier, and using 30 to 50 atomic bombs would have created a humanitarian and environmental catastrophe that would have turned world opinion against the United States and likely triggered Soviet intervention. MacArthur's plan was not a path to victory. It was a path to disaster. Truman understood that. His military advisors understood that. MacArthur either did not understand it or did not care. The firing of MacArthur established a crucial precedent in American government. It affirmed that the President, as Commander-in-Chief, has ultimate authority over military strategy, and that generals who defy presidential orders can and will be removed. That principle had been tested before, most notably when Abraham Lincoln fired General George McClellan during the Civil War. But MacArthur's firing was different. MacArthur was the most famous and respected general in America, at the height of his prestige, supported by millions of Americans and powerful politicians. Firing him was politically dangerous and personally difficult for Truman, but Truman did it anyway, because he believed civilian control of the military was more important than his own political survival. History has been kinder to Truman than his contemporaries were. Truman left office in 1953 with an approval rating of 32%, widely considered a failed president. But over the decades, historians have reevaluated Truman's presidency and concluded that his decision to fire MacArthur was correct. Truman prevented a wider war. He maintained civilian control over the military. He resisted pressure to turn the Cold War into a hot war. Those decisions required courage, and they saved lives. MacArthur spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. He worked as chairman of the board for Remington Rand, a technology company. He gave occasional speeches and wrote his memoirs. He never admitted that his plan to expand the Korean War might have been wrong. He continued to argue that limited war was a betrayal of American soldiers, and that politicians, not generals, were responsible for the failure to achieve victory in Korea. MacArthur died on April 5, 1964, at the age of 84. His funeral was attended by thousands of people, including President Lyndon Johnson and former President Dwight Eisenhower. He was buried in Norfolk, Virginia, at the MacArthur Memorial. But the legacy of MacArthur's firing extends far beyond one general's career. The decision shaped how America would fight wars for the next 70 years. Every president since Truman has faced the same tension between military leaders who want to fight wars to total victory and political leaders who understand that total war in the nuclear age is suicidal. Presidents have had to fire generals, overrule military advice, and accept limited objectives rather than total victory. That pattern played out in Vietnam, where General William Westmoreland requested more troops and expanded bombing campaigns, and President Lyndon Johnson struggled to balance military pressure with political constraints. It played out in Iraq and Afghanistan, where generals requested more troops and longer timelines, and presidents tried to limit American commitments and find exit strategies. The fundamental question MacArthur and Truman fought over in 1951 has never been resolved. Should America fight wars to win completely, regardless of cost and risk? Or should America fight limited wars with limited objectives, accepting frustration and stalemate to avoid catastrophic escalation? MacArthur believed in total victory. He believed that once America committed to war, it should use every resource and every weapon to achieve complete defeat of the enemy. Anything less was a betrayal of the soldiers doing the fighting. Truman believed in restraint. He believed that some wars cannot be won completely, and that trying to win them completely creates worse problems than accepting a draw. Both men were products of their experiences. MacArthur had fought in World War I, World War II, and Korea. He had seen American soldiers die, and he believed their deaths had to mean something, had to lead to victory. Truman had also seen war, but he had also seen what happened when wars escalated out of control. He had made the decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, and he knew what nuclear weapons could do. He was determined not to let the Cold War become World War III. The secret plan that terrified Truman was not just about dropping atomic bombs on China. It was about a general who believed his judgment was superior to the president's, who thought he could conduct his own foreign policy, and who was willing to risk World War III to avoid accepting a limited war. That was why Truman fired MacArthur, not because MacArthur disagreed with policy, but because MacArthur refused to accept that the president, not the general, makes policy, and because MacArthur's plan to use dozens of atomic bombs against China could have started a nuclear war that would have killed millions of people and possibly ended human civilization. Truman made the right call. He paid a heavy political price for it. His approval ratings collapsed. He was attacked in the press and in Congress. He received death threats. But he prevented a catastrophe. He kept the Korean War from becoming World War III. And he established the principle that in American democracy, elected leaders, not military commanders, decide when and how to use military force. That principle has held for over 70 years. It has been tested many times, but it has never been broken. And that is why MacArthur was really fired. Not for being too aggressive, not for wanting to win, but for threatening the fundamental principle that in a democracy, the military answers to civilians, not the other way around. If this story gave you a different understanding of the MacArthur firing than what you learned in school, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube this is the kind of history people actually want to learn. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are pulling declassified documents and forgotten Cold War stories out of archives every single day. Real history, real consequences, real people making decisions that shape the world we live in today. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, anywhere in the world. Our community is global, and you are part of keeping these stories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if you had family who served in Korea. Tell us what you think about Truman's decision. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure this history does not disappear into silence. These decisions shaped the world. These leaders deserve to be understood, not just remembered. And you are helping make that happen.